Hello, everyone. Today we're going to cover one of the things that I find the most interesting of my job, which is the Civil War, right? Now, the Civil War does not happen in a vacuum. The Civil War, has been brewing, for the past, in reality, 80 years. In other words, since the country was founded. Uh, One way to see it is that from day one, from the Constitutional Convention, it was kind of like countdown to the Civil War, right? So what I want to talk about today is the most important events leading to the Civil War, right? So this is basically from 1850 to 1860, right? And this is what I consider the most important events leading to the Civil War, right? So let's get started. All right. So one of the interesting questions that I still get asked in class is the Civil War about slavery? And the short answer is yes, right? Most definitely the Civil War is about slavery. But the long answer is it's a little bit more nuanced, it's more complicated. For the most part, the answer to that has to start with, well, why did the South secede? Right? Because for the most part, it's important to understand the timeline. So we have the election of 1860. The election of 1860 leads to the secession of the southern states, and then the secession of the southern states leads to the Civil War, right? So the question is, why do the southern states secede? And the answer is most definitely slavery, right? Slavery is the reason for the secession. So let me explain how that happened. So, like I mentioned before, the Civil War did not happen in a vacuum. So we need to understand the events that happened, pre-Civil War, right? So starting with, you know, slavery up to this point, right? So it is very important to understand that from the founding of the US, like I mentioned, it seems like it's countdown to a civil war because of the stark differences between North and South, right? Slavery being the main point of contention, right? There are other points of contention between North and South, but slavery is definitely the most important one and the most critical one, right? The one that causes the most divide, right? So from the beginning, the founding fathers accepted the idea of slavery kind of sort of as a necessary evil, right? The first presidents, right? Washington, Jefferson, even abolitionists like John Adams saw slavery as something that is going to go away on its own, right? As something that it's unfortunate, but not as the number one priority, right? The number one priority was having a stable nation, all right? So slavery changes over time, and what I mean by this is that the cotton gin basically explodes the idea of slavery. It catapults slavery to something that the founding fathers did not had in mind, and slavery really becomes something that it becomes very difficult to eradicate, right? To abolish, right? Now, something that it's important to note: presidents at the time did not have the power to abolish slavery. If that would have been the case, then John Adams or his son Quincy Adams would have abolished it, right? But presidents did not have that power, all right? Congress does not have that power, right? Because of the balance they have in Congress, right? The Supreme Court is gonna attempt to fix it eventually with the Dred Scott case, right? But there is no way to settle the issue, and by 1850 it's gonna turn into something very ugly, right?
So this is the territories that the United States acquired from Mexico after the Mexican-American War. So in 1850, California wanted to apply to become a state. So the problem was the same, right? How do we maintain the balance in Congress? If you add one free state, then you have to add another slave state. This time, it didn't work that way. The solution wasn't to add another slave state. The solution was to get a new fugitive slave law, right? So we already had a fugitive slave law, but it wasn't being enforced as the South wanted to. So now they passed a new fugitive slave law that is going to basically change the dynamics of the American politics in the 1850s. Right? So let me explain this.
What is happening with the Fugitive Slave Act is that when slaves used to escape and touch ground in the North, they were considered to be, in free territory, and nothing could be, done to them, right? They were considered free people, right? Now, what the Fugitive Slave Act does is basically say it doesn't matter if slaves escape to the North. No, these northern states are required to enforce the laws of the South, meaning you need to catch the slaves or help catch the slaves and send them to the South. And so this is actually going to create a new profession, right? Which is slave catching, right? Something that, for example, my friend Santo Benavides here, was a part of, right? Slave catching, right? You would go to the north and you would be like a bounty hunter hunting slaves, right? Now, the problem with this is the following, guys, right? It's actually forcing states in the north that have already abolished slavery, it's forcing them to participate in slavery now, right? What does this mean? Well, you need to think about it. The reason slavery becomes such a contentious issue in the 1850s is because if you're a citizen of places like, for example, Connecticut or Vermont or whatever northern states, right? There's no slavery in your state, right? It has been abolished or is being abolished at the time, right? So in a way, you've done your part. Like there isn't a lot else you can do about it because in your territory you don't have slavery. But what the Fugitive Slave Act is doing is basically saying, I know you have abolished slavery and I know you don't like slavery, but you're gonna need to be complicit on it and participate on it, even if you don't like it, because that is the deal we made with the South. Now, if you see slaves in your land, you need to contact the authorities. You need to participate on it. And if you are complicit on it, you are going to be responsible for it, right? So it's really incensing the North, right? Basically being forced to follow other states' laws. The idea was that if your slaves escape and you are in Pennsylvania and you are in Connecticut, you are in any of the states that slavery has been abolished, it doesn't matter. You need to help people catch the slaves, right? So it's very contentious, right? People are very unhappy about it, right? And this is what makes slavery such a big issue in the 1850s, right? People were kind of like, I don't want to say they were indifferent, right? These people in the North are very anti-slavery, right? But in a way, they're kind of done with what their civic duties, right? Their territories don't have slavery. Their job is more about don't allow it to expand it anymore, right? But in my territory, it's abolished, right? Now the Fugitive Slave Act is forcing you to participate on it, right? This is just the first reason why the idea of the Civil War is about slavery, right? Because this is what's provoking the secession eventually, right? It's gonna be the Fugitive Slave Act as part of the Compromise of 1850, and then eventually it's also going to be the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? What the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is in 1854, it opens up the possibility of slavery in territories that had previously not allowed slavery, right? So the Louisiana Territory, not the Mexican cession, but the Louisiana Territory had been settled that the southern states could not have slavery, right? What the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is say that law is outdated. We're not doing that anymore. So what we're doing is in those states, we're allowing people to choose whether they want to have slaves or not via popular sovereignty, meaning people vote, and if people vote and they want to have slavery, we're opening up the door for slavery, right? So these are very controversial decisions, guys, right? Not just because you're overturning a previous deal that you had, but the idea of popular sovereignty on slavery is very problematic, right? Basically because what you're doing is you're deciding over someone else, right? You're not letting slaves themselves vote. You're basically saying we're voting whether we want to have them or not. They're not going to participate in the voting, right? We will decide whether we want to have slaves or not, right? That's just number one, right? That's not even counting that slavery goes against every principle in the Declaration of Independence, right? But these decisions are becoming very problematic, right? 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act; 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act; 1856, you're going to see the Dred Scott decision. And the Dred Scott decision, to make a long story short, is basically a court case that a gentleman basically sues his master because he says, in my territory, my master lives in a territory where there's slavery, but we travel to a territory where slavery is not allowed, where it's been abolished. So that means I'm free, right? So that is the court case, right? So what the Supreme Court does is basically they're trying to resolve the issue of slavery, right? They're basically realizing the president can't fix it, Congress can't fix it, so we, the Supreme Court, will make the ruling, right? And what the ruling is that slaves have no participation in the courts, right? So basically makes them property, right? They have no rights in court, and you basically can do whatever you want, right? They cannot sue you. You can do whatever you want to them because they're not U.S. citizens, right? And they cannot sue you in court, right? So if you want to punish them, you want to murder them, you want to do whatever, they have no legal standing in court, right? So these decisions are incensing the public to a point that it hadn't been before, right? So whereas slavery was a thing that people disliked and a thing that a controversial issue that people were displeased about the situation in the U.S. in the 1850s, it becomes a very controversial issue, right? It becomes the talking point of the time, right? So in 1860, when we have this presidential election that Lincoln will win, the South secedes because of that, right? The South decides that Lincoln becoming president is enough for them to secede, right? Because Lincoln very clearly wants to abolish slavery. Not very clearly because he's not exactly an abolitionist, but he wants to limit the expansion of slavery. So, this is why when we talk about the Civil War and people ask, is the Civil War about slavery? Well, why did the South secede? That's basically the main question. Well, why did the South secede? And the South seceded because they knew Lincoln was going to abolish slavery, right? Or limit its expansion, right? And, slavery becomes such an important issue, such a critical issue at the time, because of the issues that happened in the 1850s, right? Those three are the biggest ones. And if you've seen the lecture I did on the American Revolution, that I talk about escalation, this is the same thing, right? You have the Fugitive Slave Act, you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which I didn't even mention, but you also had bleeding Kansas during the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? Basically people willing not only to interfere and cheat in federal elections, but willing to murder each other, because of their beliefs, right? And here we see the first time of John Brown, right? But I'll cover that later, right? So it's escalation, right? From Fugitive Slave Act to Kansas-Nebraska, bleeding Kansas, to the Dred Scott decision. Every decision the government is making up to that point feels very in favor of slavery, and it's just incensing, the citizens. And it really seems like by this point, civil war is kind of sort of unavoidable. So let me know what you think. At what point between these three events, Fugitive Slave Law 1850, Kansas-Nebraska 1854, or Dred Scott decision, in which of these 3 points do you think the Civil War could have been avoided? Because by 1859, with the attack on Harper's Ferry by John Brown, it's pretty much almost unavoidable by then. But by which point do you think the Civil War became a point of no return? Let me know what you think. I'll be around. Be safe, guys, okay?